Hey guys, welcome back to the Readers. I hope you are having an amazing day. Let's get right into the stories. The first one is an entitled people story. Imagine fighting a multi-million-dollar developer who is illegally building on your family's land. After months of legal threats, his own lawyer sent me a letter with a demand that gave me the perfect, most brilliantly stinky idea to stop him for good. My family has owned our farm for 3 generations. We're not a huge operation, just about 150 acres of decent farmland where we grow corn, soybeans, and hay. We also keep a small herd of cattle, maybe 40 head at most. It's honest work and it's been good to us. The farm sits right off a major highway that runs between 2 mid-sized cities. Over the years, I've watched that highway get busier and busier. What used to be a quiet 2-lane road is now a 4-lane thoroughfare with constant traffic. I never minded much. The noise didn't bother the cattle, and we were far enough back from the road that it didn't affect our daily lives. About 5 years ago, things started changing rapidly in our area. The city to the east began expanding outward, swallowing up farmland and converting it into suburban developments. Strip malls popped up where cornfields used to be. Traffic got heavier, property values started climbing, which was good for us on paper, but also meant our property taxes went up significantly. We started getting calls from real estate developers wanting to buy our land. At first, they were polite inquiries. We'd decline, they'd thank us for our time, and that would be that. But as the development crept closer to our property, the calls became more frequent and more aggressive. One developer in particular became persistent. His company specialized in building those cookie-cutter residential communities with names like Meadowbrook Estates or Heritage Hills, even though there were no meadows, brooks, or hills anywhere nearby. He called every few months with increasingly generous offers. I always gave him the same answer. The farm wasn't for sale. My grandfather built this place up from nothing. My father expanded it, and I intended to pass it on to my kids someday. Money wasn't everything. He didn't like that answer. About 2 years ago, the developer bought the property directly adjacent to ours. It was a smaller parcel, maybe 30 acres, that had been owned by an elderly couple who finally decided to retire and move closer to their daughter. Within months, he had broken ground on a new development. I wasn't thrilled about having a bunch of houses right next to our property line, but there wasn't anything I could do about it. He owned that land fair and square. The development went up fast. Within a year, there were about 40 homes in various stages of completion. They were nice enough houses, if you like that sort of thing. Big, boxy things with tiny yards and no character. But people seemed to want them, because they sold quickly. That's when the complaints started. New homeowners would call our house to complain about the smell from our cattle operation. Others complained about the noise from our tractors in the early morning. One particularly memorable caller demanded we stop spreading manure on our fields because the smell was ruining her backyard barbecues. I tried to be patient and explain that we were a working farm and these were normal farming activities. We'd been here long before their development existed. Most people eventually accepted this and moved on, though some continued to grumble. The developer, however, saw an opportunity. He started calling me again, but now his pitch had changed. He told me that my farming operation was incompatible with the residential area that was developing around us. He suggested that the complaints from homeowners would only increase and that local government might eventually force us to scale back our operations. Wouldn't it be easier to just sell now, take a generous offer, and avoid all that headache? I told him the same thing I always told him. Not interested. Then came the Billboard incident. I was out checking fence lines one morning when I noticed survey stakes along the edge of our property that bordered the highway. They were clearly fresh and they weren't ours. I followed the line of stakes and realized they were marking out a section right along the road. When I got back to the house, I pulled out our property survey and studied it carefully. Our property line ran right up to the highway right-of-way, just like it always had. Those survey stakes were on our land, no question about it. I called the county to ask if there were any permits filed for construction on or near our property. After some checking, they told me that a permit had been issued for a billboard to be constructed along the highway. The permit listed the developer's company as the applicant, and the location was described as being on the parcel adjacent to ours, but those survey stakes were definitely on my property. I immediately contacted the developer's office. After being transferred around several times, I finally got someone who claimed to know about the Billboard project. They insisted their survey was accurate and that the billboard would be on their property, not mine. I told them I had a recent survey that said otherwise, and that if they put anything on my land, I'd have it removed at their expense. The person on the phone got snippy with me and suggested I have my survey rechecked because their engineers knew what they were doing. I hired a surveyor to come out and verify the property line. It cost me money I didn't really want to spend, but I needed to be absolutely certain. The surveyor spent a full day checking boundary markers, measurements, and comparing everything to the county records. His conclusion was clear. The survey stakes were about 15 feet onto my property. The billboard, as planned, would be almost entirely on my land. Armed with this information, I contacted the developer again. This time I spoke directly to him. I explained the situation calmly and professionally. I told him I had a certified survey showing the billboard location was on my property, and I was not giving permission for any construction. He brushed me off. He claimed his survey was correct and mine must be wrong. He said they'd already contracted with the billboard company and construction would begin next week. He suggested I stop wasting everyone's time with frivolous complaints. I tried one more time, sending him a certified letter with a copy of my survey and a formal notice that any construction on my property would be considered trespassing. I got no response. The following Monday, a crew showed up with equipment to begin construction on the billboard. I drove down to the site and asked to speak to whoever was in charge. The foreman was a decent enough guy who was just trying to do his job. I explained the situation to him and showed him my survey. He called his boss, who called the developer. After some back and forth, the foreman told me that the developer insisted they were on the correct property and they had been instructed to proceed with construction. I told the foreman that he was about to build on my land without my permission, and if he continued, I would take legal action against both his company and the developer. He radioed his boss again. This time the instruction was to pause construction while they sorted things out. For a few days, nothing happened. Then I got a call from a lawyer representing the developer. The lawyer was aggressive from the start, accusing me of trying to extort his client by making false property claims. He threatened to sue me for interfering with a legitimate business operation. I stayed calm and told him I had a certified survey that proved the billboard was on my property. He demanded I send him a copy, which I did. A week later, the construction crew returned. No call, no letter, no acknowledgement of my survey. They just showed up and started digging holes for the billboard foundation. I called the sheriff's office and filed a complaint for trespassing and property damage. A deputy came out, looked at my survey, looked at the construction site, and told the crew they needed to stop until the property line dispute was resolved. The foreman was frustrated but complied. The developer's lawyer called me the next day, furious. He threatened to sue me for harassment and for damages caused by the construction delays. He claimed their survey was conducted by licensed professionals and was indisputable. I suggested we settle this with a third-party survey conducted by a county-approved surveyor, with both sides agreeing to accept the results. He grudgingly agreed. The county surveyor came out 2 weeks later. This was an official survey, not just a private one. The surveyor spent 2 full days checking everything, cross-referencing historical records, and using GPS equipment to verify boundary lines. The results came back crystal clear. My survey was correct. The billboard location was on my property. The developer's survey had made a significant error in calculating the property line. I thought that would be the end of it. I was wrong. Instead of apologizing or working out a solution, the developer proposed a compromise. He would acknowledge the billboard was on my land, but he wanted me to lease him that small strip of property for a nominal fee so he could complete the project. He made it sound like he was doing me a favor. The lease terms he offered were insulting. He wanted a 20-year lease for a ridiculously small amount of money, with options to renew for another 20 years. Basically, he wanted to take control of that section of my property for potentially 40 years while paying me almost nothing. I declined. He increased his offer slightly, but it was still nowhere near fair market value for leasing prime highway frontage property. More importantly, I didn't want a giant billboard on my land, especially one advertising his housing developments. When I declined again, he changed tactics. He filed a lawsuit claiming that because the billboard permit had already been issued and construction materials had already been purchased, I was causing him financial damages by refusing to allow completion of the project. He argued that since the error in the survey was an honest mistake, I should be required to either lease him the land or sell him that strip of property at a reasonable price. It was absurd, but I had to hire a lawyer to defend against it. Legal fees started piling up. The stress was affecting my family. My wife was worried we'd lose the farm over this. My kids were hearing things at school from kids whose parents lived in the development. The lawsuit moved through the system. My lawyer filed for summary judgment, but the courts were backlogged and it took months to get a hearing date. Meanwhile, the developer kept filing extensions and additional motions, probably hoping I'd give up or run out of money for legal fees. During this time, I started receiving more complaints from homeowners in his development. I suspect he was encouraging them behind the scenes because the timing was too convenient. Several complaints were filed with the county about various aspects of our farming operation. Suddenly, inspectors were showing up to check our manure storage, our water runoff management, our equipment safety compliance. We passed every inspection, but each one cost us time and stress. Then one day I was driving past the construction site where the billboard was supposed to go. The equipment and foundation materials were still there, just sitting unused. The developer was clearly keeping everything on site, probably hoping he'd eventually win his lawsuit and could resume construction immediately. The foundation holes had been dug before the sheriff stopped them, and now they just sat there half-finished. That's when I had my idea. I went back and carefully reviewed my property survey and the exact location of the disputed billboard site. The spot they had chosen was right at the edge of my property near the road, but it was still technically part of the field I used for crop rotation. I called my lawyer and asked a hypothetical question. If someone tried to build something on my property without permission, and I needed to use that property for normal farming operations, was there anything stopping me from doing so? My lawyer thought about it and said that as long as I was conducting legitimate farming activities on my own property, I had every right to do so. In fact, my right to use my property for its intended agricultural purpose would likely supersede any claims the developer might make, especially since he never had permission to be there in the first place. That was all I needed to hear. I should mention something about modern farming equipment. A manure spreader is a trailer that gets pulled behind a tractor. You load it with manure from the cattle operation, and it has a mechanism on the back that spreads the manure evenly over the field as you drive. It's an essential piece of equipment for any farm with livestock. Our manure spreader is one of the older models. It works perfectly fine, but it's big, and it's not the prettiest piece of equipment. When it's loaded, it sits pretty high off the ground. The next morning, I drove our tractor down to the disputed billboard site. I positioned our manure spreader directly in the spot where the billboard was supposed to go, right at the edge of our property facing the highway. I parked it lengthwise so it created a nice long visual barrier between the road and the partially dug foundation holes. Then I did something I'd been planning. I went to a local sign shop and had them make a large banner. Nothing fancy, just white text on a blue background. The banner read, "This property belongs to my farm name, not for sale. Billboard construction is on private property without permission." I built a simple wooden frame that I could attach to the hitch area of the manure spreader, and I attached the banner to that frame. It stood up high enough that traffic could easily see it from the highway. I made sure to load the spreader fresh with manure. Can't let it sit too long in the spreader or it damages the equipment and creates problems. Every Monday morning became my routine. Hook up the tractor, refill the spreader, and park it back in the same spot. The response was immediate and extremely satisfying. Within hours, I got an angry call from the developer demanding I remove that eyesore from the construction site. I calmly explained that the manure spreader was on my property, positioned in a field that I used for agricultural purposes. I was simply storing farm equipment on my own land as part of my normal operations. He threatened to have it towed. I pointed out that having someone come onto my property to tow my equipment without my permission would be theft. I also mentioned that the manure spreader was quite heavy, and that I kept it regularly loaded as part of my normal farming operations. You could hear his frustration through the phone. The banner facing the highway started getting attention. People driving by could clearly see that there was a property dispute and that the developer was trying to build on someone else's land without permission. It wasn't a good look for his company, especially since he was trying to sell the remaining houses in his development. His lawyer called my lawyer, demanding the manure spreader be removed. My lawyer asked why we should remove farm equipment from our own farm. The developer's lawyer argued it was deliberate obstruction of their construction site. My lawyer pointed out that it wasn't their construction site since they didn't have permission to build there. The developer tried a different approach. He called the county, claiming the manure spreader was a safety hazard being so close to the highway. A few days later, an inspector came out, reviewed my survey documents, checked the measurements against county records, and eventually confirmed in writing that the manure spreader was completely on private property, well outside the highway right-of-way, and posed no safety issue. Days turned into weeks. Every Monday, I'd reload the spreader and park it back in the same spot. My banner remained clearly visible to thousands of cars passing by every day. The smell wasn't pleasant, particularly on hot days when I'd just refilled it, but that's farming. Anyone driving by got a very clear reminder that this was agricultural land, not some pristine suburban area. The developer's housing sales in the adjacent development reportedly slowed down. Potential buyers would drive by, see the manure spreader with its banner, smell the agricultural aroma, and reconsider whether they wanted to live next to an active farm. The homeowners who had already bought houses in the development were furious, but their anger was mostly directed at the developer, not at me. They had been sold on the idea of a nice, quiet suburban community. Instead, they were next to a farm with a loaded manure spreader prominently displayed near the entrance to their neighborhood. About 2 months into this standoff, something interesting happened. The developer's lawyer sent my lawyer a formal letter. They claimed that if I was going to insist on using that section of my property for agricultural purposes, then I needed to actually use it for agricultural purposes, not just park equipment there. They suggested this proved I was only parking the spreader there to harass their client, not for legitimate farming reasons. My lawyer called me and read the letter. I could hear him trying not to laugh. He asked what I wanted to do. I told him I'd be happy to use that section for legitimate agricultural purposes. The next week I had a load of mushroom compost delivered, about 20 tons of it. If you've never smelled mushroom compost, count yourself lucky. It's made from composted horse manure, straw, and other organic materials used in mushroom farming. When it's fresh, it smells absolutely rancid, but it's also excellent fertilizer and a great soil amendment. I had it dumped right on that strip of land where the billboard was supposed to go, covering their half-dug foundation holes in the process. Then I spread it around properly using the manure spreader. Then I planted a cover crop of clover in it, which is standard practice for soil improvement. This was completely legitimate farming. I was improving the soil for future crop rotation. The fact that it smelled absolutely horrible for about 3 weeks was just an unfortunate side effect of proper agricultural management. The smell was incredible, not in a good way. Every time the wind blew toward the development, you could smell it from hundreds of yards away. My own family complained about it, though they understood why I was doing it. The developer's lawyer tried to complain that I was deliberately making the area unpleasant. My lawyer pointed out that they had specifically demanded in writing that I use the land for agricultural purposes, and that's exactly what I was doing. They couldn't argue with that. The homeowners in the development were beyond angry now. Several of them organized a meeting and invited me to attend. I was nervous about going, but I figured I should face them directly. At the meeting, I explained the entire situation. I showed them copies of my surveys, the timeline of events, and the letter from the developer's lawyer demanding I use the land for agriculture. I explained that I hadn't wanted any of this, but I wasn't going to let someone build on my property without permission. To my surprise, most of them understood. Several admitted they felt deceived by the developer, who had painted a picture of a quiet suburban neighborhood without mentioning the active farm next door. A few were still angry at me, but the majority directed their frustration where it belonged, at the developer who had created this mess. One of the homeowners was a real estate attorney. After the meeting, he pulled me aside and told me that the developer's lawsuit was going nowhere. He said any competent judge would throw it out, and the developer was probably just trying to outlast me financially. He also mentioned that if the developer kept this up much longer, I might have grounds for a harassment claim. I passed this information along to my lawyer, who agreed. The pressure kept building on the developer. His lawsuit wasn't progressing. His business reputation was taking hits every day that manure spreader sat there, and now his own customers were turning against him. The local newspaper even ran a story about the dispute, complete with a photo of my manure spreader and banner. I installed a game camera to monitor the site after I noticed someone had been walking around the spreader one night. The camera caught a few nighttime visits from someone in a truck matching the description of the developer's personal vehicle, though they never did anything after they saw the camera was there. Finally, about 4 months after I first parked the manure spreader, the developer's lawyer called my lawyer with a new settlement offer. This time, it was much more reasonable. They would acknowledge that they had made a survey error, they would pay all my legal fees, they would remove their equipment and fill in the foundation holes they'd dug, and they would abandon any plans to build a billboard on or near my land. In exchange, I would remove the manure spreader and agree not to pursue any further legal action against them. I agreed with one additional condition. The settlement had to include a formal written acknowledgement of their survey error and their unauthorized attempt to build on my property. My lawyer explained this would be useful documentation if they ever tried anything similar in the future. After some back and forth, they agreed to all terms. Once the settlement was signed, the developer moved quickly. Within a week, his construction equipment and materials were gone. A crew came out, removed what remained around the proposed billboard site, filled the foundation holes properly, and restored the grade. My legal fees were reimbursed, and I received a formal written acknowledgement that the company's survey had been wrong and that its attempted construction had crossed onto my property without permission. Only after all of that was completed did I move the manure spreader back to its usual place near the barn. I took down the banner too, although I kept it folded in storage. After everything that happened, throwing it away felt premature. The clover grew beautifully on that strip. The mushroom compost may have smelled terrible for a few weeks, but it did exactly what compost is supposed to do. The following season, I planted soybeans there, and that section produced better than it had in years. The billboard was never built. From what several homeowners told me later, the dispute had become an uncomfortable subject for the developer. Potential buyers kept asking why a manure spreader with a property rights banner was sitting beside the entrance and why the neighboring farmer was publicly accusing the company of trying to build on land it did not own. The developer eventually sold the remaining lots and moved on to projects elsewhere. A few residents from the subdivision later approached me to apologize for the complaints they had made about the farm. Once they saw the surveys and the letters, they understood that the developer had been using their frustration with normal agricultural smells and noise as pressure against me. Most of them had been sold a picture of peaceful suburban living without anyone clearly explaining that their houses bordered an active cattle and crop operation. I never blamed them for buying the houses. I only blamed the people who thought surrounding my family's farm with development somehow gave them the right to take part of it. Some of those residents now buy eggs and beef from us. One of them joked that living next to a farm was not so bad as long as I kept the manure spreader near the barn. I told him that was always where it belonged, provided nobody tried to put a billboard on my field again. I still own all 150 acres. We still grow corn, soybeans, and hay. We still raise cattle. My children are learning the same work my grandfather taught my father and my father taught me. Nothing about the farm fundamentally changed, except that one strip of soil is healthier now, and I have a very useful letter from the developer admitting exactly where the property line is. Looking back, the developer's biggest mistake was assuming that money, lawyers, and construction permits could turn his survey error into my obligation. When that failed, his lawyer tried to argue that I was not genuinely using the disputed strip for farming. So I used it for farming. I fertilized it, planted it, improved the soil, and continued treating it as what it had always been, part of a working farm. The smell, the banner, and the manure spreader were not what defeated him. His own refusal to respect the survey did that. The farm equipment simply made the dispute impossible for him to hide. The billboard is gone, the developer is gone. The farm is still here, and if anyone ever tries to build on that field again, I still know exactly where the manure spreader is parked. The next one is a malicious compliance story. This happened about a year ago, but I only recently found this subreddit and realized I had a story to share. It is not especially extreme, but it was satisfying. I worked at a buffet restaurant where, during every shift, each staff member was assigned a specific job. The usual roles included cashier, runner, food rotation, table management, cleaning, washing dishes, and similar tasks. I was usually assigned as the runner because I was faster than most of the others. The runner's job was to walk to the kitchen, collect whatever food was ready, and bring it back to the restaurant. The kitchen was quite far away, and we were expected to complete each trip within 3 minutes. If we took longer than that, our supervisor would call either us or the kitchen to ask what was taking so long. There was a counter separating the kitchen from the corridor where we pushed the food cart. Normally, we would walk up to the counter, ask for the food we needed, and wait. The kitchen staff would usually place it on the counter within a few seconds or a minute. Then we would load it onto the cart and return to the restaurant. Sometimes, however, the kitchen was understaffed and extremely busy. If we only needed something simple, such as sauces, green onions, honey, or jam, we would occasionally go inside and grab it ourselves. This was not an official rule. It was simply something staff had done for years when the kitchen was overwhelmed. One day we needed several sauces, 1 or 2 food items, and some green onions. I knew exactly where the sauces and green onions were stored. After asking for them and waiting for more than a minute, I called out, "Coming in! I am grabbing green onions!" Then I stepped into the kitchen. As I was pouring the pre-cut green onions into a bowl, one of the chefs walked toward me and started shouting. He told me to leave the food alone. that it was not my job, and that I was doing it incorrectly. I was not doing it incorrectly. I asked him what the issue was because we had been doing this for years. He said that preparing those items was his job and that I was only supposed to ask for what I needed and wait at the counter. Fine. The next time I needed supplies, I went to the kitchen entrance while the same chef was busy preparing something else. Then I started loudly calling out the entire order. Sauce 1, sauce 2, green onions, honey, this item, that item, and this other thing. Most of those items were things I already knew how to find and could have collected myself in less time than it took to shout the list. The chef did not respond for several seconds, so I shouted the entire list again. Then I did it a third time. While he was finally grabbing one of the sauces and putting it on the counter, he said, "It is only me in here. Stop screaming. Just put the order paper down and wait." I explained that I had to return to the restaurant within 3 minutes, otherwise our supervisor would call to check what I was doing, and I would have to explain that the kitchen was taking too long to provide the supplies. He finally said, "Okay, just come in and grab it yourself." I reminded him that he had specifically told me the other day that I was not supposed to touch anything because it was not my job. Apparently he had changed his mind because he said, "Forget it, just do it." But I reminded him again that he had made the rule official. Because of that, I would need to contact our supervisor and confirm that I was now allowed to enter the kitchen and collect the items myself, so the chef had to run around the kitchen for several minutes gathering everything I needed. After that, he never complained about us entering the kitchen to collect simple items again. The next one is an entitled people story. For the last 2 years, 2 friends and I have volunteered at an event that raises money for a local club. We are not members, but a friend of ours is, and the organization did not have enough members to manage everything, so we offered to help. It is actually a good local cause, although it is not local to us. The town is about an hour away. Members are required to complete a certain number of volunteer hours for the organization every year, either at this event or one of their other events. The first year, our job was taking tickets and handing out goodie bags to the public. That was actually kind of fun. The next year, we were assigned to monitor a tent where alcohol was being served and make sure no one left the area carrying alcoholic drinks. We took the early shift starting at 7:30 in the morning with the understanding that we would be relieved at noon and could then enjoy the event. That did not happen. We were not given bathroom breaks. We asked, but were told we had to find someone to take our place, and no one ever showed up. We were standing in the entrances of a huge tented pavilion in 85-degree heat. We were never given water, and we were discouraged from getting it ourselves because that would mean leaving an entrance unattended. There was one person assigned to each entrance, so we could not even talk to one another. We could only text during the long stretches when we were standing there with nothing happening. At one point, I was told off for checking a message on my phone. I was 44 years old, so I told the person that they could not dictate when I was allowed to look at my own phone. They said I was going to be reported. Then this person held out their hand and told me to give them my phone. Apparently, I could get it back when I was done for the day. I simply said no thank you and put it back in my pocket. I did not engage any further because my mother had been dead for years, so I had no idea who they planned to report my naughtiness to. I had not been spoken to like that since I was 12 and got in trouble for not paying attention in class. I was not a child, and this person was neither my teacher nor my employer. I certainly was not handing an expensive phone to a stranger so they could hold on to it until I was done. When noon arrived, we were told we could not leave because our replacements were not there yet. One of us was finally relieved around 12:15, so that person started rotating between the remaining entrances so we could use the bathroom and get water. At 12:30, I was done waiting. I found one of the organizers and told them we would be leaving in 5 minutes, so they needed to replace us immediately. At first they said no, we needed to wait until more volunteers arrived and they might need us there for a while. I said absolutely not. We had been standing at the entrances for more than 5 hours in rising heat without water or bathroom breaks. We were not allowed to sit because it supposedly did not look right. I was only in my 40s, but I was not willing to stand there indefinitely with no relief. They eventually found people to replace us, but told us they were disappointed that we could not stay until the end of the event, which would have been after 9 that night. I told them we had never agreed to work that long. They responded that our leaving early would be noted. Now this year has rolled around, and I recently received an email giving me my assignment for the upcoming event. I replied and explained that I had not signed up and already had other plans for that weekend. I do not actually have plans, but I am never volunteering there again. They responded that my assignment was non-negotiable because I had not volunteered at all this year and needed to be more of a team player. They also brought up my infractions from the previous year, which included looking at my phone in front of the public and leaving early. They said I had not been respectful toward the organization's leadership when I was corrected about my phone because I had said I would keep it with me and continue checking messages from my friends whenever I was not busy. Apparently, that behavior was inappropriate and would not be tolerated this year. It took me about an hour to fully absorb the entitlement in that message. I wrote back with excruciating politeness and explained that I was not a member of the club and had never been a member. I also pointed out that I did not even live in the community that benefited from the event. I had traveled an hour to volunteer because I thought it was a worthy cause. Apparently nobody had connected my friends and me to the club member who had originally recruited us. I decided to leave her out of the dispute. Then I outlined what had gone wrong the previous year. I explained that as a 44-year-old adult, I was not going to be disciplined for briefly checking a message from one of my friends asking whether I needed water, especially when I had not been allowed to leave my station to get any. I also reminded them that we had signed up for a shift from 7:30 in the morning until noon. Instead, they tried to make us remain until 9 at night and heavily guilted us when we firmly refused. I further explained that I had been treated disrespectfully by the organization's leadership despite being an unpaid volunteer. Because of that, I had no intention of supporting the organization with my time going forward, and I asked them to remove me from their list. Their next email was not quite an apology. They said everything had been misunderstood because members understood that they might be asked to stay late, and everyone had assumed my friends and I were members. They also reminded me that club policy did not allow people to have their phones with them during events. Then they said they had already assigned my jobs for August and that it was important for me to arrive on time because otherwise I would be putting them in a difficult position. I replied that their rule about phones did not apply to me because I was not a member, had never been told about the club's rules, and would not have followed that rule under the conditions they had placed us in anyway. I also said I did not want the club to suffer from any more misunderstandings. If I volunteered again, I would leave at the exact time I had agreed to, and I would not stay even 5 additional minutes. Since that could apparently create problems for them, it was better that I not attend at all. I added that the 2 friends who had volunteered with me would be joining me in my supposed plans that weekend and would not be available to help either. I finished by saying I hoped the event went well, but that in the future if they had unpaid volunteers who were not required to work for the club, they should not treat those people the way they had treated us. I have not heard back yet. Anyway, thank you for watching.